the chat, and we'll look at them and prioritize as many as we can before we wrap at about 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. All right, so we are now going to jump in to this very interesting panel. The first speaker is Professor Scott Cummings. And Professor Cummings is the Robert Henningsen Professor of Legal Ethics and Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law, where he's taught and written about the legal profession, public interest law, law and social movements, and community economic development for nearly 20 years. He's a longtime member of the UCLA David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy, a specialization that is exciting to that is training students to become public interest lawyers. And I have to say, as a UCLA law grad from long ago, I've been super excited to see the strength and power of this public interest program at UCLA. Professor Cummings is a co-author of the forthcoming article towards a new procurement law, reclaiming competition for the common good, and is also an author or co-author of numerous articles, several books, including the first public interest law textbook. Professor Cummings.
You want me to take it away now?
You can take it away.
Okay, I'm taking it away. So I'm going to thank you for that wonderful, generous introduction, Madeline, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen and just introduce a few slides to guide my comments. So here goes sharing the screen. And if someone can give me the thumbs up that that's working. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to talk about a little known, as Madeline shed a little light on this, little known but extremely important legal rule that has really wide-ranging impact on the way that federal procurement operates, both directly by federal agencies and by state and local governments using federal money, or pass-through grants, as we often call them. So just first, by way of background, as Madeline already indicated, I teach about economic development at UCLA and started working with JMA to investigate the competition rule several years ago, really exploring it as a constraint on local innovation in infrastructure and specifically in transportation spending. So when a local transit agency, as Madeline suggested, uses federal funds to purchase buses or other rolling stock, turns out they have to be able to set the criteria to do a public bidding, sort of what requirements for bidders they may place in RFPs in a way that's limited by federal law, since federal funds are being used and they come with these very important strings attached. What we found through our research was that a big string is really more like a thick rope that constrains what states and localities can do, is this so-called competition rule. And this led us to really dig into that rule to try to figure out where it came from and to really ask what might be done to make it work more effectively to promote a social return on federal investment that would actually build stronger communities around principles of economic fairness and racial equity. And so after lots of work by my amazing co-authors, Feliciagura and Christy Veeder, with lots of help from Madeline, we produced an article, a draft of which is now available, that digs into this history of the competition rule, how it's been interpreted and really misinterpreted in our view in ways that we think limit its potential. And so we all know that in the procurement process, government entity solicits bids from 2 or more contractors and then chooses one from which it will buy the goods and services it requires through a prescribed bidding process. When we talk about the competition rule, it's this pretty vague general standard that operates in various places within federal statutes and regulations, which I'll talk about in a second, that says such a bidding process must be conducted through full and open competition. And how this works is that state and local agencies that use federal funds have to gain approval from the federal grantor agency. And so when state and local agencies want to use federal funds and set bid criteria that are locally oriented, they have to go ask permission, and the feds are going to evaluate those local bid criteria based on this competition rule. And this sort of leads to our big question, which is what does full and open competition mean? And to answer that question, we dug back into the history of federal procurement, which is actually pretty fascinating, but very little understood and highly technical. And so, given our time constraints, I really want to just give an overview of this historical trajectory of the competition rule and really leave you with some of the important takeaways and some of the really important constraints that it's imposed on innovative procurement that really advances the common good. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the historical origins of the competition rule, which dates back well over 50 years. And I'm going to gloss over some important details, but we can talk about those in Q&A. I want to just start by saying that there are two really important big picture takeaways. So if all of this kind of is fuzzy, the things that I really want to convey and for you to remember are two things. First, the legal meaning of competition as a governing principle in these pass-through procurement regimes, constraining state and local bid requirements, has shifted over time from an original principle really focused on good, transparent procedures designed to prevent corruption in bidding, things like pay to play, to this current focus limiting bid awards to those offering the lowest possible price, irrespective of whether that price actually offers a positive overall social return on federal investment. The second big takeaway, I think, from the history is that this definition of competition has really infiltrated the entire federal procurement legal regime in ways that are not firmly supported by the text of the rules and the underlying legislative history, which we think therefore provides a really important opening for reform at this critical moment. So in a nutshell, what our research shows is this. So we start to see pro-competition rules in federal procurement statutes as early as the 19th century. And so if you can see my pointer hovering here, sort of in the first step in the early 19th century. And these rules are pretty clearly designed to prevent backroom deals by mandating that bid criteria be openly advertised to prevent corruption. And these
Scott, let me just stop you real quickly. We've gotten a couple of people in the chat asking if you can make the slide bigger.
Slide bigger, sure. Is that making it bigger?
Yes, one little bit more.
One little bit more, just hold on a second here. Let me see here, hold on. How is that?
I'd say that it's good to go, keep going.
Can you see that good? Okay, so so there's sort of the steps to building the contemporary competition rule. Starts way back in the 19th century again. We see some statutes mentioning competition and really designed to promote transparent process, anti-corruption principles. And again, these were very much focused on fair bidding at a time when there wasn't really a lot of procurement going on. If we fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, we really see the flowering of what we now think of the competition rule. And this came from a moment where the federal government becomes really, a major force in local infrastructure development through the passage of the Federal Aid Highways Act, this Federal Aid and Highways Act in 1956, which was then the largest public works project ever passed. And in that act, we see Congress for the first time using this term competitive bidding. And we see in the important 1968 amendments to the act, which were codified in 23 USC Code Section 112B, which is often referred to in relationship to the competition rule. We see competition stating for the first time that contracts should be awarded to the, quote, lowest responsive bid submitted by a, quote, responsible bidder. So we first see this low bid language. However, despite the reference to lowest bid, two things are clear in the statute. First, localities can define criteria of responsibility for bidders that include things like creating good jobs and not discriminating. So to be in the pool as a bidder, you have to attest to doing those things. Second, localities during this original time period are permitted to impose conditions precedent to bidding. So to be in the pool, for example, a bidder has to meet equal opportunity criteria that are set forth in bid advertisements. So the bottom line here is that when the competition language is first introduced, nothing's preventing state and local standards to channel procurement dollars into contracts that provide a broader social return on investment, so long as the process of bidding remains transparent and fair. enter the Reagan administration and its effort to deregulate and shrink the federal government's footprint. In 1984, we see the Competition in Contracting Act passed for the first time, adopting this language of full and open competition in relation to executive agency procurement. And then the really important event comes in 1986 in the form of a legal opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, which is this elite unit inside the Justice Department responsible, among other things, for providing legal opinions on ambiguous laws, which many of you know. And OLC, as it's called, commissions a legal opinion interpreting this Federal Aid and Highways Act, Section 112B, so now touching pass-through federal procurement. And the question presented in this opinion was how this Section 112B applied to a New York City law at the time that gave a bid bonus in public works contracting to companies that certified they had no investments in then apartheid South Africa. And despite the fact that there was no evidence that certification, this anti-apartheid certification, impacted the bidding pool or the contract price paid by New York City for transit goods, the OLC says New York law is invalid because it violates the competition rule, which for the first time, it defines as singularly focused on maximizing the number of bids, quote, and, quote, ensuring the lowest possible price. So this is a really important moment. For the first time, the weight of the federal government comes down on the side of this very narrow definition to outlaw cities from standing against apartheid. And what we found was that this interpretation, in what's a very, very brief and pretty thinly cited legal opinion, only a couple pages long, is not really compelled by the text or history of the rule, and yet imposes this new efficiency standard in line with Reagan's neoconservative agenda that's applied broadly and really becomes sticky and is used to disqualify any local bid requirements that are deemed, quote, unrelated to performance. And this has a really profound ripple effect. And it leads to the Office of Management and Budget a couple of years later, incorporating the language of full and open competition in what is now the uniform guidance. I'll come back to that in just one second. And then we fast forward to 2013. We have Obama, and based on lots of good organizing that says, hey, this competition rule is really not based on a good legal foundation, Obama DOT agrees to go back to the OLC and to ask it to revisit the question of whether it could approve local bid requirements that put social equity criteria like local hiring more front and center. So Obama OLC goes back, looks again at this old Section 112B and language about lowest responsive bid, and it issues a sort of mixed ruling. On the one hand, it unfortunately affirms the idea that the competition rule applied to substantive bid criteria, but in doing so, it sort of subtly changes the rule by saying that local requirements are okay so long as I don't unduly limit the number of bidders. So this 2013 OLC opinion sort of opens the door, crack to local requirements. There could be some impact on the bidding pool, but just not too much. And this was an important step in the right direction, which I think Felice will talk about in more detail. But the standard's still pretty vague. And again, based on our research, not compelled by the statute and legislative history in ways that really still carry forward this hesitation to go big in using procurement for the common good. So in conclusion, we sort of come all the way up the ladder to the kind of modern conception of the competition rule, which still elevates efficiency standards, right? Getting that low price, maximizing bidders as the core understanding of the competition rule that was really not designed, if you go back through this history, to use these criteria to disable local experimentation that advances important social policy goals. So I know I'm at the end of my time, so I just want to leave you because Felice is going to talk about some of the concrete ways that the competition rule stifles local innovation. I just want to end up showing how this misinterpretation has just been fully incorporated into federal regulations. So this is the standard in the OMB uniform guidance, which I mentioned is super important, applies to all federal executive agencies. And the guidance is a major regulation that applies to federal pass-through grants from the executive branch. And you see here that this language of full and open competition is front and center, erecting barriers around price and bidding pool that I've already described. And it also links to prohibitions on geographical preferences, which are highlighted in subsection C. So The challenge is to really make the case that what competition here means is not what's been handed down over time, since that meaning is really contested. Because until this interpretation is changed, federal law strictly limits what states and localities can do to really make procurement work for US workers. And this is a great point, I think, to turn it over to my colleague, Nestor Davidson. So thank you.
Thank you. And let me pick up on that. Our conversation today is mostly going to...
Nestor, before you start,
yes.
I'm going to give you a little introduction.
Please go ahead.
Because you are an esteemed member of our panel. So Professor Davidson joined Fordham University Law School in 2011 and was named the Albert A. Walsh Professor of Real Estate, Land Use, and Property Law in 2017. He is an expert in property, urban law, and affordable housing law and policy, and is the co-author of the casebook Property Law Rules, Policies, and Practices. He founded and serves as the faculty director of the law school's Urban Law Center, and he also served as special counsel and principal deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now go forth.
Okay, thank you so much, and really terrific to be with all of you here. And I guess before I jump in, I wanted to say congratulations on the research, Scott and Felice and Madeline. You know, this is really, really important and couldn't be more timely. I'm going to shift the focus slightly. We're mostly focused on reforms to federal law, but as Scott pointed out, this will be implemented at the state and in many important ways at the local level. So the work I've been doing in recent years has really focused on state and local dynamics. And I just want to interject a little bit of that context so that as we think about reforms at the federal level, we can also understand the context that those reforms will land on in the state and local arena. So to begin, not just in procurement, not just in policies like local hiring, but across a range of labor and employment issues, cities over the past 2 decades have been significant innovators. So if you think about the Fight for 15, the movement for minimum wage, CTAC in 2013 was one of the first places to make a move in that direction, and that became the beginning of a national movement for the Fight for 15. San Francisco in 2006 was the first jurisdiction to have paid sick leave. Employment discrimination. Minneapolis was the first jurisdiction in the country to add sexual orientation to their human rights law. This was way back in 1974. And cities have also been innovating in fair scheduling and ban the box, in prevailing wage and project labor agreement laws across a range of important labor and employment issues. And what has resulted is a pushback from states. I should have gotten that movement before. So at the same time, I want to throw this chart up from a wonderful report that the Economic Policy Institute did, a couple of years ago, although it's still quite timely. Not much has changed in the last 2 years for reasons I'm happy to talk about. But states for really the last 2 decades, but increasingly after 2011, 2012, have been removing local authority over a range of labor and employment. So this chart shows you the increasing range of minimum wage, fair scheduling, PLAs, prevailing wage, also adds the gig economy, which is another area. Some of these are very narrow, very targeted. In 2015, St. Louis, for example, passed a law to raise the minimum wage in steps up to from the state floor of $7.65 an hour up to eventually $11 an hour. It was in litigation for 2 years, but it finally came into effect in May of 2017. Literally 2 weeks after it went into effect, the state of Missouri passed a law to preempt the local minimum wage 2 weeks later. Some of the preemption goes after specific cities or sort of small groups of cities like that. I worked on a case as an amicus in Ohio involving Cleveland's longstanding and very successful local hire program called the Fannie Lewis Law. State of Ohio preempted it, and the city fought all the way up to the Supreme Court and unfortunately lost. But some of this is very sweeping. So in 2015, for example, the state of Michigan passed what is commonly called the Death Star bill, It wiped out essentially all local authority over a broad range of labor and employment in one bill, everything from wages to benefits to organizing rights to scheduling. And all of this is part of a trend of what scholars have identified as new preemption. So this isn't what states used to do, which is set a uniform set of state policies to ensure important state interests were advanced, or to really look at significant interlocal conflicts. This is really much more targeted, much more punitive, much more about deregulation, about saying to local governments, you may not regulate, or you may not use your own procurement powers or your own grant-making powers to advance social policy, even if the state isn't going to do anything. It's just a pure policy disagreement, and that's something new. And it covers almost every area of policy that local governments are involved in, not just labor and employment, but land use, housing, environmental law, gun safety, the sharing economy, immigration. Almost every area that local governments are innovating in or active in, states have begun to preempt, and increasingly so over the last decade. It's also much more punitive, much more partisan. In Florida, for example, if you try at a local level to pass a firearm safety law, a local official who's involved in that, a city council member, can be removed by the state from office, can face individual fines that the city can't reimburse that official for, the city can't represent that official, and it's a hugely chilling effect. And so it's become really a significant element of state and local law. It was very prominent, this aspect, these kinds of city-state conflicts during the pandemic, where we saw states overriding local mask mandates and local stay-at-home orders. We're seeing that now continuing to play out in Texas, in Florida, in other places. And this trend of cities being targeted for not just their regulatory authority, but their own exercise of their own management authority is, if anything, getting worse. So in the 2021 legislative session, we saw 27 states introduce measures to ban or make it difficult for school curricula to examine racism in American history. 8 states passed such law. 27 states had statutes banning discriminatory anti-trans bills. Several states preempted local eviction policies. 4 states prevent local governments now, have passed laws to prevent local governments from re-examining police budgets. Georgia, Florida, Missouri, and Texas. And 10 states have passed laws now really limiting local public health authorities moving forward at a time when we're still in the midst of a health crisis. So as the federal government rolls out truly one of the most significant procurement and infrastructure investments in a generation, it's really important to understand the context in which those investments are going to be made. I'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A, happy to elaborate on any of this, but let me just close with a couple of thoughts or just a thought about a question that I frequently get when I talk about preemption, not just again in labor employment, not just in procurement, but in all of these areas. So what is the scope for the federal government if the federal government, for example, is looking to local governments to advance an infrastructure priority, but a state says to a local government, you may not use your authority to have a local hire policy, again, as in Ohio and a number of other states, can the federal government interpose between the state and local government, or can the federal government condition federal funding on the state not having a policy like that? And, you know, it's a complicated question. And it really turns in many ways on complicated questions of state authority and the clarity of the authorization to act at the federal level. But the short answer is there is a precedent that says that with a spending program in particular, if there are federal conditions that are germane, and we've been talking about procurement conditions that limit the discretion of states and local governments to undertake certain kinds of procurement, but it can go the other way, it can be freeing. So if the federal government attaches conditions, if those conditions are clear, if the federal government is authorized, if states truly have the discretion to accept or not those funds, and the conditions are germane. And I think freeing the range of innovation in procurement would be germane, then federal law would control the use of federal funds. I think the law should be clear on that point. Again, there's some real important technical details that we can get into in the Q&A, but I think that principle is a really important one. So with that, let me hand it back to Madeline for our next speaker.
Great, thanks so much, Nestor. That was super helpful. So the incredible power that we could have, we could see, we could give to state and local governments, especially local governments, if we were to reverse this historic misinterpretation of the competition rule. So next, I want to introduce my colleague, Feliciagura is the National Legal Director at Jobs to Move America. And Felice has over 15 years of experience in labor law, worker rights, and environmental law. Prior to joining JMA, Felice managed the Freelance Isn't Free law and intake and referral programs at the Office of Labor Policy and Standards in the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs. Before that, she spent 7 years as a research attorney, the Labor's Eastern Region Organizing Fund. Felice began her legal career with the environmental group of Venable LLP in Washington, D.C. Take it away, Felice.
Hi, thank you, Madeline, and thank you everybody for joining us. Jenna, if you want to go ahead and share the presentation, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about procurement law and state and local innovation and focus on the effect that the competition rule and restrictions have had on state and local policy, what evidence we have of interest at the state and local level for innovation for the common good. I'm going to look at analysis of data on competition and local hire, and finally outline our recommendations for clarifying the uniform guidance. Next slide, please. So we know that the Common Grant Rule was originally enacted in 1988, and it included aspirational text stating that under federalism, states should be given the maximum administrative discretion possible with respect to national programs they administer. And that really there was this idea that that within the uniform guidance there would be room for states and municipalities to take action according to their needs and their laws and their programs. And of course that was the vision, but it was not how things ended up working out in practice. The uniform guidance became a restraint on tribes, states, and municipality. And more insidiously, the competition rule or the narrative around competition really fostered fear of progressive policy. And by the competition rule, it's the idea that the more specifications on bids will reduce the number of bidders, thereby raising the contract price and reducing efficiency. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the lack of data on that side of contracting. But this narrative became all pervasive from the local to the international. And we actually know that I found articles at the international level saying that debarring for corruption, maybe this might adversely affect competition. It's really, none of this really matches common sense, like the understanding that we might have in hiring a home renovation contractor, that it's important to understand the contractor's history or to reject a suspiciously low bid. And of course, since there's no private right of action in this realm, it also limits even private voices in this discussion. But we do know that the following efforts by states and municipalities have been rejected because they did not conform with the conception of full and open competition that we get from the uniform guidance. So the city of Cleveland versus Ohio, the FHA rejected a Cleveland ordinance requiring 20% of public construction worker hours to be formed by residents of the city. That of course went to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit ended up invalidating the ordinance on a technical ground and actually opening up some opportunity for competition, but that was not part of the decision around local hire in this context. FHA rejected a New Jersey prohibition on public bidding by political contributors as violative of Section 112B. This, of course, was to address corruption, something that we know in the history of competition in procurement is really essential. A San Francisco ordinance requiring contractors to provide domestic partner benefits was rejected. And finally, a Los Angeles law requiring disclosure of contractors' predecessors' participation in slavery. So not a limitation on who could bid or anything about their bid, just a disclosure, was also rejected as being too limiting on competition. Next slide, please. And of course, in the Bush era, these types of prohibitions became part of the executive orders from both Presidents Bush. So they prohibited PLAs or project labor agreements or requirements that agencies might have that contractors enter into PLAs. And again, the explanation was that it would stifle competition. And of course, George W. Bush's reasoning went so far as to claim that requiring PLAs would somehow limit job opportunities, which is sort of contrary to what we know about PLAs in general. And these misconceptions ending up extending to state law. One New York court explicitly called out PLAs that sought to create social policy and address racial and gender inequities as not being sustainable in court. And of course, we know in reality, these decisions were conclusory. They ignored PLA's long and productive history on major public works since the 1930s. They also disregarded the fact that these are pre-hire agreements that level the playing field with regard to labor costs rather than benefiting one party. Next slide, please. So FHWA and FHA have allowed for some flexibility in contracting since 1990. The Special Experimental Projects Number 14, SEP 14 program allows state DOTs to evaluate alternative or innovative contracting techniques. And then they can go on to become operational and be enshrined in federal regulations. But to be honest, DOT even acknowledges that they can't really call these innovative contracting techniques because so many of them are familiar to everyone who works in contracting and potentially procurement. And I think it's also important to note that the contracting technique of lowest responsive bid never had to go through this experimental process to become the standard in competition. It's never been vetted quite as rigorously as these other methods of bidding. But what we do know from the SEP 14 program is that interest at the state level has been strong in this type of innovation, even in the highly structured universe of SEP 14. So there have been, since 2003, 174 SEP 14 projects, and 22 of them have been bid through best value contracting. Of course, the local labor hiring pilot is probably the best known to this audience of the SEP 14 programs and provides the most usable data to the public to evaluate these conceptions of competition. Next slide, please. So what we found out from the local labor hiring pilot program, which ran from 2015 to 2017, and the purpose was to allow DOT to assess whether states could use local hiring grant spending. It included permission to hire locally according to economic factors and among veterans. And of course, we are aware that it has been reinstituted with expanded hiring provisions, but we're just looking at the original program. And it really allowed us to deal with the lack of data on this issue. We reviewed data available from 19 states that participated in the program. Projects were valued at $1 million to $1 billion. And we found, first of all, that the local hire provision did not result in decreased market participation. We compared a range of bids to independent cost estimates, and there was no considerable variation. And the price ranges spanned similar languages between local and non-local hire. There was also no systematic difference in the number of bids. So we had 9 comparisons of total number of bidders, and we actually found there were more bidders on local hire projects. So 4.8 average for local hire and 4.0 average for non-local hire. Next slide, please. So with the analysis of the law and data that you've heard in mind, I'm going to go over our recommendations for clarifying the uniform guidance to allow for state and local innovation while ensuring that there's appropriate competition in public bids. Please keep in mind that this is our conception of how to clarify the uniform guidance to deal with some of these issues that might affect communities and states. But there's so much that could be done on labor standards to respond to the climate crisis and even in technological innovation. And we would, of course, love to hear folks' ideas on what else could be done with the uniform guidance. The first recommendation is to remove the prohibition on geographic hiring preference that Scott mentioned. This would allow for a U.S. jobs plan, which I'll discuss in the next slide. and make way for racial equity in contracting through project labor agreements and community workforce agreements. We also have provisions to address workplace issues that we are aware of with advanced technology and automation, and to address misclassification. Next slide, please. So by removing the geographic preference, we could also create the opportunity to allow for the US Jobs Plan scoring mechanism in bidding. The US Jobs Plan is a contract-based incentive to include a job-related scoring mechanism that boosts bid ratings or price, and it's based on concrete commitments by the contractor on targeted hiring, good pay and benefits, and pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship. Not only does this raise market conditions, the transparency component of this allows for monitoring of participation. Next slide, please. Allowing recipients to require project labor agreements or community workforce agreements to meet diversity and inclusion goals, so to address inequalities in the labor market. It can also allow communities to create pathways to good jobs with good pay and benefits, and encourages and allows them to do more for underrepresented workers through their procurement spending. Next slide, please. Finally, we have recommendations to deal with some of the issues that we know reduce workplace standards and employment opportunities across industries and sectors. For automation and electric vehicles, we're recommending provisions to require contractors to train incumbent workers on new equipment rather than sell extended warranties, and assess workforce impacts and plan to mitigate any projected job losses. And finally, we are asking for a certification that all work done on federally funded contracts is done by properly classified workers, an issue that pervades all forms of employment, which I know from my time working with the Freelance Isn't Free Law. It is literally everywhere. So with that, I'm going to pass things back for Madeline for discussion.
Thank you, Felice. I know we are packing a lot of information into a very short time. And I promise we are going to it's a 60-page article that the team has submitted for publication that has a lot to digest. We're going to make that available to everyone who participated in this webinar. We will put this recording and the slide presentations on our website. And we look forward to many other conversations to unpack these ideas that we've put out here, that there is this ridiculously unnecessary, Scott called it a rope that's constraining the ability of state and local governments to use federal dollars for the common good, to maximize the impact of the purchase of construction and manufacturing and service contracts from private companies for the common good and the public good. So I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions, and then I do want to say that I misspoke that the webinar was advertised originally for an hour. Several of the panelists have agreed to stay a little bit extra so that we can continue to take questions after the hour, because I know we are running short on time. So feel free, some of us will stay till 3:30 if you want to stay on, but we did advertise it as ending at 3 o'clock Eastern. So my first question, we are talking about this idea of competition. And in some ways, we are all using that word, but we mean different things. And so what I would like to do is ask our panelists to kind of flesh out the different meanings we're talking about here so that we can be really clear. So I want to point out that recently President Biden signed an executive order designed to promote competition in the American economy. And the executive order talks about how robust competition is critical to preserving America's role as the world's leading economy. He then orders whole of government competition policy. He talks about fair competition as key to the ability of small businesses to thrive and the ability to create, that high road companies to thrive. And so we've argued in the article and in the presentation, the brief presentation we're making here today, that competition, the way that competition, the word has been used to interpret what kind of procurement specifications are allowed is wrong. And so that the use of the term competition in some ways has been a constraint to all of the types of actors that the president is talking about. So how do we square the arguments that fair competition is an important component of public procurement with the notion that competition policy shouldn't block public policy? And I want to start with you, Scott. If you could talk about competition in the antitrust context versus competition in the procurement context.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a super important question. And I think, my general response to it is that the Biden vision that you just articulated and our vision, I think, seem pretty consistent. So the Biden vision seems to say competition should mean innovation, really understood as letting lots of different ideas and approaches interact in the marketplace to create different kinds of value, right? So it shouldn't be about allowing big companies to dominate the market and crush competition and then race to the bottom by lowering wages and degrading the environment just to extract profit, right? That's not what competition should achieve. And I think our idea is basically the same, because it says, what should the goal of competition be in the procurement context? It can't just mean giving contracts to companies that are going to race to the bottom and lower prices because they outsource work or they suppress wages. That can't be the goal, right? That doesn't give us the appropriate social value. It doesn't create innovation that gives us different kinds of value. So our vision of competition is that it should produce social value through innovation, should allow companies to compete along multiple dimensions that are important and that do important things like address economic inequality and uplift racial equality. So in that sense, I think that what we're putting forth is really nicely meshes with the Biden visions to create a really important and coherent conception of competition that really advances these broader public interests.
And I just want to go to you, Felice. So can you talk about the analysis that we have done around competition as a way to guarantee a fair process versus competition designed to regulate the substantive criteria in procurement?
Yeah, so in looking at the legislative history of a lot of the foundational text to the regulations we're working with, and also just, sort of best practices in contracting, the notion that sort of competition and reducing bid specifications is sort of the purest and best way to promote competition or to promote efficiency in contracting is not actually the norm and hasn't been the basis for public contracting for many years. In particular, issues with collusion and corruption. And of course, we also know that with public spending, directing the public spending throughout the history of these laws and these regulations, public spending to promote economic growth, both not just within, having contractors be able to get the best price possible, but promoting economic growth with work for contractors that are able to meet certain standards. And then of course, promoting employment, for example, with the highway, building our highway transit system. So what we are looking at are other ways in which you could incorporate these downstream and qualitative effects into contracting, which has long been understood to be part of what government should be promoting. Additionally, these costs can't be ignored just because they're not part of how we're envisioning contract bids to work or what should be in the lowest responsive bid. They will ultimately affect the cost of the contract to both governments and society. So what we really looked at with our proposals were, we're at this moment of crisis and opportunity in this country. We've come through this, sort of possibly unprecedented experience. We've seen so starkly the inequities that our current system fosters, and also based on our experience with workers and with procurement and contracting we came up with these recommendations to address what we see as the downstream and qualitative effects.
Thank you. So I'm going to just ask one quick question, and I'm going to ask you all to try to summarize in as few words as possible. So what steps can the administration, the Biden administration, take to ensure that the $1 billion, the $1 trillion plus in infrastructure funds that are proposed create the good union jobs that the president has talked about, as well as racial equity and solutions to the climate crisis? So in just a few sentences, what are the key things that the administration can do to ensure that we maximize the power of this potential investment? I'll start with you, Scott.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to what Felice just mentioned, I mean, establishing a correct interpretation of competition is crucial. There are steps that can be taken that don't require a statutory amendment. They can be implemented through revisions to rules like the UMB Uniform Guidance that really put forward the appropriate and historically correct interpretation of competition that allows states and localities to put out bid criteria that are really going to advance the broad goals that the Biden administration has put front and center. And so I think the key is to restore competition to its original focus on procedural fairness, creating these important sort of level playing field, right? Rules of the game that create transparency. And so everyone knows what the rules are. So that cities can then say, we want to give infrastructure funds to companies, not just because they offer a bare bone price, but because they work to promote the precise goals that are at the core of this infrastructure plan and really help America build back better.
Nestor?
I would just add that I think it's really important as the federal government makes these historic investments to understand, as I said before, the context in which there are constraints beyond just federal law operating on cities that want to innovate and want to take equity seriously. And I would just encourage the federal government to think about the entire range of authority, not just in the procurement context, but in the civil rights context and in other areas where there are really strong obligations and a commitment at the federal level to advance equity. And that can't just be in anti-discrimination, as important as that is, but that is in bringing the full weight to bear of the federal government in using the resources it is investing through that equity lens.
And Felice?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So I think transparency would be the priority amongst everything, especially with respect to labor standards. We know even in programs where the standards aren't as high, like Davis-Bacon in certain regions, the transparency really creates a lot of leverage in communities. And then I think with this, that's part of sort of the procedural aspect of competition. And then what we've really been talking about is permission to states and municipalities to do this innovation, to identify their unique needs and add them to their competition regimes, basically. But basically allowing states and municipalities to take action to address these issues that have long been just, like I've said, they're voices that have been long excluded from procurement.
Great. All right. Well, so we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to do my best to take these in order or to ask some of these. Okay. So I'm going to start with a question from Richard Edelman, which is, consistent with your presentation, isn't the major problem that effective competition has become synonymous with competition as to price?
Yes, absolutely. That's the major problem. And I think, what we want to stress really heavily in the presentation and even in more so in the paper is that price focus, that singular price focus that really came out of the OLC opinion in 1986 commissioned by the Reagan Justice Department is not based on sound reasoning with respect to the legislative and regulatory history. And so really moving away from that singular focus, which we have seen a little bit, but it's still kind of hovering over, and it makes state and local agencies, frankly, reluctant to innovate just because they don't want to put forward all the effort and machinery to be told that, hey, this is going to affect price in ways that don't allow them to move forward. And so even though we've seen some openings, it's still so important in the way that local officials think about it, that it does need to be revisited and revised so that this innovation can really flourish.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to start taking some of these in the question and answer in the chat. So from Abel Rodriguez, who, if anyone, has standing to bring claims under 49 USC section 5325J when a contractor is engaged in problematic practices if the local contracting agency refuses to address those problems, e.g. rampant contract violations by the contractor? And Abel, do you want to say what 49 USC section 4325J is, or do any of our panelists know? Well, I can say it's the procurement statute. It's the procurement statute codified. So the one thing that maybe we should have made clearer in the beginning is that there are really two separate regimes for procurement, public procurement using federal dollars. And one procurement regime is in the procurement, there's the Competition and Contracting Act, there's, I think it's the Procurement Act, and then there's the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. And those all apply to only direct federal contractors. So companies that contract directly with the federal government and federal agencies. The rules we're talking about are in the second set of regulations, which are what are called the OMB Uniform Guidance, which used to be known as the Common Grant Rules. And those rules apply to state and local governments that use federal funds to procure. So I think, Abel, what you're talking about is the direct federal funds, but I think the question is probably the same, which is that when key federal laws like the minimum wage or like the Equal Employment Opportunities Statute, EEO, and other really important federal labor laws are violated by a public contractor, why can't the agency, or why won't the agency that is doing the contracting engage in enforcement? And I think one of the things that we are seeing is that there's enormous opportunity for the Biden administration to clarify that, because we've also had the experience where agencies that are using federal dollars to procure, the contractors violate, commit sexual harassment or gender discrimination, and there's no remedy other than the federal remedy. So the federal government could go and make that clearer in the different statutes, but right now, or in the different regulations. I don't know if anybody else has any reflections on that. Okay, I'm going to go to other questions here. Dennis Olson, my understanding is that Congress explicitly allowed school districts to use local geographic preference in the Farm Bill in the early 2000s. Are any of the panelists aware of this? And if so, can you update as to whether this preference is still allowed today?
I'm aware that it exists. I'm not sure if it's still allowed today. I think one of the issues that seems apparent to us as researchers is that these exceptions are sort of piecemeal, and what we're looking at is a broader exception. I know the uniform guidance applies to almost all grants funded by the federal government and usually pass through another entity. So this would be clarifying for those grant-based programs, and that would be a much broader allowance of local hire. I'm not sure whether the Farm Bill exception is still available today.
I can say that the rule in the OMB uniform guidance prohibits geographic preferences except where they are allowed by statute. So if they're allowed by statute, then they would be allowed. Okay, so the Trent McDonald said, would these same policy changes re competition and procurement to raise labor and employment standards and improve the common good that you are all recommending also apply to other federal funds to public and private employers, providers like Medicare, Medicaid, Pell Grants, National Institute of Health grants, et cetera?
No, not directly. It wouldn't. I mean, I think the principles are applicable, but the specific mechanisms that we are proposing to modify be specific to these contracting relationships that Madeline has indicated. So really focusing on federal grants coming down from federal agencies that get passed through to state and local governments that then contract out with private entities for various infrastructure needs. So our interpretation is really focused on affecting that particular system. Although I think that we're hopeful. I think that the principles that we're proposing of really kind of rethinking more broadly how federal funds are used and what kind of broader social value are created with them could be extended to those other areas that you are mentioning, although it would be through sort of different legal mechanisms.
Yeah, and where it does apply, I think in certain circumstances, potentially the competition rule has been even more insidious in these contexts. So potentially with Medicare, if grants are funding home health aides, the labor standards with respect to those workers who are coming into people's home and take a very trusted role in their lives and need a lot of cultural competencies, you would assume that local hire and labor standards to ensure that, they don't feel the need to be predatory in this role in the home would actually relate to the actual purpose of the contract. The specification is part of the work performed. So I think that where it does apply, it would be great. And I think those areas also demonstrate the issues with the competition rule.
So I thank you. Nestor, Professor Davidson has to leave, and I want to give him a chance to just make a closing comment. And in particular, if Nestor, if you could address if the administration adds explicit permission in the OMB uniform guidance, for example, to cities to use these policies around labor or racial equity or climate or any of the things you're talking about. What chance do cities have to be able to actually do it, especially in that long list of states where there's preemption?
Look, I think, first of all, thank you again for letting me join. This is a great conversation. I'll just say that if the federal statute authorizing the preemption of contrary state law in a spending context is clear, if the conditions are germane, if the state enters into a federal spending program willingly, and most federal highway funding, the classic case, South Dakota against Dole, was a federal highway case that involved the spending clause and conditions on spending. I think if you meet all of the requirements, I do think that the precedent suggests that federal conditions would prevail, notwithstanding contrary state law. And if you think about it, there are federal priorities all the time that states might disagree with. But if you're going to enter into a federal program and you're going to do so willingly, then federal rules should control. So thank you again, and I apologize for having to jump off.
Thank you so much for having joined us. I am going to go through some other questions. I would say this is kind of your last chance to put any questions in either the question and answer or the chat. So let me see here. So we haven't talked, from James Singer, we haven't talked about the Service Contract Act which applies only to direct federal contractors. Can this act be applied to defense contractors who transfer subcontracts from union to poorly paid non-union workers? I don't know if anybody has any reflections on that. I would say, James, that would have to be something that would dealt with in a different set of regulations than the ones we're talking about, because those have to do with direct federal contracts. But and does anyone have any other thoughts about that? Nope. Okay. So from Hillary Wilson, some of the panelists use the term efficiency when discussing the goals of procurement policy. Is the term efficiency used in procurement statutes? If so, has the meaning of this term changed over time, like the concept of competition? Should we also be rethinking the meaning and practical application of the concept of efficiency?
That's a great question. It doesn't appear in that specific term in the statute and regs. There is reference to cost effectiveness. And I think the sort of overarching theme, again, sort of dating back to the story generated through the Reagan administration's reinterpretation, was that, and this is something that we delve into in the paper quite deeply, a lot of folks that came into the administration in the 80s were really influenced by concepts of efficiency that were coming out of the law and economics movement, which were really focused on issues that were related to price and things that could be quantified in a particular way. And those efficiency concepts really did influence the way that the regulations that we're talking about were interpreted. And although that terminology doesn't specifically appear in the regs, there are analogous concepts like cost effectiveness that get interpreted through an efficiency frame and then come to mean something that we suggest isn't really justified by, or isn't strongly compelled, at least, by the underlying legislative history and standards. And so it's sort of an overarching idea that kind of comes in and informs, but yes, plays itself out specifically in the way that the language is interpreted. And cost effectiveness is one of these terms that is in there, but could mean lots of different things depending on what you're trying to orient the procurement around. And so cost effective doesn't just mean low price, it means sort of promoting different kinds of overall social value and return on investment, really. And that return on investment can and should, we think, include things like racial equity and economic fairness.
Great. So let's see, Raymond, I think it's, someone asks, in view that a lot of the discussion is policy analysis and advocacy, can JMA help to produce a procurement competition toolkit for local community organizers within local municipalities striving to promote equity? And I would say that this kind of goes along with another question here, which is, have we communicated this this analysis of the history of procurement law, which is, you know, an analysis, as you'll see when we send you the paper, that goes back to the Revolutionary War, that procurement, that the goal of competition is to create a level playing field and to protect against corruption. First, we have communicated with the administration and sent some recommendations and the paper, the draft paper, to different departments in the administration. I think it's up to people on both the inside and the outside, including unions and community groups, to talk about why it's so important for cities and states to be able to maximize the benefits of this infrastructure investment. And so we will, if you're interested, please let us know, and we will let you know about ways to advocate for that, as well as to later on advocate with your own city and state. So any last let me see, any last, I would say, I don't see any other questions. Let me see. Well, let me see, there might be. So if we could then just take a minute, I think there are not any more specific questions. So if Scott and Felice, you want to give just a very quick close, and then we will close it out for the day.
Felice, I'll let you go first.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think as we noted, you know, this is just a very difficult and exciting time in, you know, what we can do in this country to rectify a lot of what we've not done right in the past. So for racial equity, for inclusion, and also to allow states and municipalities to really address their own needs and take the lead in innovating to address the problems they have. You know, this, as I keep emphasizing these issues, the competition rule, the way it works now, it really doesn't, there's no common sense to it. And I've done a lot of work in private procurement reform with environmental, social, and governance factors, which have really taken off in recent years. And it's almost like the private sector is willing to take into to factor in issues that maybe the government's not ready to, which are these broader, these downstream effects, these issues that move beyond just what's in the specifications of a contract. But it's a really exciting time. There's so much we can do. And we'd also just love to hear from all of you about any of your ideas for how to reform the regulations to address some of these downstream and qualitative issues. Thank you so much for joining us too.
Yeah, just briefly adding to that, I would, you know, what I think excites me about this project most is that it's an opportunity to target something very specific, a legal rule that's very specific and that's not widely known, but the change of which can really make a huge difference in permitting the kind of local action that we're all committed to seeing that can improve the quality of lives for so many members of our community. And I think that opportunity doesn't come around a lot, and it's presented here in a way that really excites me. And I think it could be the product of important mobilization to really make it happen. And so I'm really excited about the potential for this to make a difference. And as Felice said, really excited to hear from all of you about the work that we've done. And as this paper gets circulated to folks, I really encourage you to reach out and give us feedback directly. I'd be happy to engage with people about it because we really are uncovering the system that's quite complicated, and learning from others that have experience with it is really essential. So I'm really excited about that collaboration as well. So thanks for all being here and for engaging on this important topic.
I want to thank everyone for listening in. It was great participation today, and I know a lot of people from all walks of life, including within the administration. I want to thank you for participating. We know that in some ways this proposed kind of resetting the table on the proper meaning of competition is controversial or will be controversial. I think especially maybe less on the policy level and more on the kind of idea of stare decisis, and that this has been the way things have been done. But I think now is the time where we have to push back and make sure that every dollar that we are spending of taxpayer dollars is creating the maximum benefit, double and triple bottom line benefit for every community. So yes, there will be opposition as suggested in a couple of the comments, but we are very hopeful that this administration will work to really set the ship in the water correctly. So again, thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists. And please let us know if you have any questions or comments. And also everyone who attended will get a copy of the article, and we will put the recording of this and the PowerPoints on our website. Thank you very much.